Welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Lana Sherman, and I'm your host this evening. Here at NFRPP, we bring timely programs to educate, inform, and foster civic engagement. Tonight's program will explore cryptocurrency, debunking myths, understanding realities, and exploring economic and social impacts. Our moderator is Peter Coy, a freelance journalist covering economics, business, and finance. He has written for many publications, among them the Associated Press, Bloomberg Businessweek, and the opinion section of the New York Times. Professor Hilary J. Allen is a professor of law at the American University Washington College of Law. She is an internationally recognized expert on financial stability regulation and new financial technologies. She shares her expertise with financial regulatory bodies worldwide, as well as with the IMF and World Bank. Also on our panel this evening is Mark Hayes. He is the Associate Director for Cryptocurrency and Financial Technology with Americans for Financial Reform and with Demand Progress. He works to ensure effective regulatory oversight of cryptocurrency and other financial technologies. Please visit our website to read more extensive bios of our presenters. As always, we will take audience questions. Type your question into the Q&A box, and we'll answer as many as we can. A video of tonight's program will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. Welcome to NFRPP. Peter, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Lana. As Lana said, we want this to be interactive, so we encourage you to enter your questions in the Q&A. Don't wait till the end. Put them in as soon as something that pops into your head. I'm going to start fielding questions from you early on in the program. And I want to start out with a pretty obvious question, and I'll start with Hilary. What is cryptocurrency anyway?
So cryptocurrency is a notation on a database, really. So you may have heard of this thing called a blockchain, which is a type of database. And if there is a recordation on there that you own something associated with that blockchain, then you own a piece of cryptocurrency. But with most cryptocurrencies, there's nothing behind it. It's just this notation on the database.
Okay. I see these little images of Bitcoins with like a little symbol on them with a B. What's that?
Those are graphics. There have been times that actually they made crypto assets into graphics. You may have remembered the NFT craze, but really, these things really are a notation on the database. It's hard to represent, and people like stories and pictures. And so you notice those things with the B, they often look like gold coins, right? They're not gold coins, but that's sort of the association that they're going for with those graphics.
Yeah, but I'll turn to Mark. Mark, even though, as Hilary says, Bitcoin is just a notation on a ledger, that's not a bad thing in and of itself, right? I mean, the deed to my house is also on a ledger somewhere. So being on a ledger doesn't mean it's not a real asset, right?
No, not exactly. I mean, I think when you look at the history of financial technology, as it were, one of the biggest innovations hundreds of years ago was the creation of a double book ledger where people could more accurately record money coming in and money coming out. And the key to that was there was one central database with one person minding the store. And so being able to facilitate ledger technology has led to a lot of advancement in finance. I think with crypto, what crypto purports to be is a new way of using ledgers via digital technology that is supposed to replace that central intermediary, to take out the middleman, as it were, and allow people to, quote unquote, freely transact. But as we'll talk about, the devil is in the details, and that's not always or often the case.
Right. So I guess what we're saying here is that the concept of a blockchain and a decentralized ledger, that's a legit idea. The question is, the Bitcoin is an example of a use of this ledger. So why don't we get, and I don't want to focus just on Bitcoin because there are other cryptocurrencies, but just generally speaking, what do you own when you own, say, a Bitcoin? And maybe Hillary.
Well, this is, I think, the distinguishing feature that you were getting at before. Of course, ledgers are extremely useful technology, and they've been around for a long time. I actually quibble that the distributed ledger is an advance over the ledgers we already had. I think the ledgers we already had actually did a better job of what we need them to do. But in the end, you're just trusting, even with Bitcoin that's supposed to be trustless, even with all these crypto assets that are supposed to be trustless, you're trusting that that record on the database means something.
Okay.
And with your house, like you brought up, you trust that because the sheriffs recognize that that recordation on the ledger that's your house means that that's your house, and they're willing to enforce it.
Right.
With a crypto asset, I mean, there's nothing real backing it or behind it, and you sort of need courts to enforce your claim on it. And with a lot of financial assets, the way those claims get enforced is frankly through bankruptcy when things go badly. And what they'll do is they'll take all of the assets that belong to the issuer and they'll divide them up between all the claimants. But what are the assets that you're going to divvy up if Bitcoin fails, right? There's no there.
Well, that's it. So it's not that I guess there's two potential problems. One is that a dispute over a Bitcoin, over the ledger, doesn't have a clear means of resolution. So then you have to go to the courts. But I think the deeper question is, even if that works out and it's well understood, okay, that's your Bitcoin. What is it? I mean, a usual asset is something that provides value of some kind. And maybe I'll turn to Mark on this one. What value do you get with that Bitcoin you own?
Well, I think that's one of the challenges in trying to understand the so-called value proposition of crypto and blockchain and the risks that come along with it, based on how people understand that valuation. I mean, simply put, even people who are enthusiasts of crypto would admit that with Bitcoin, its value is really in the eye of the beholder. And so with that, you have an asset that's priced simply based on what people are willing to pay for it or buy it at any given time. Now, there are plenty of assets out on markets that are sold and traded that way. But the difference, and I think maybe zooming out a bit, is that Bitcoin, from its origination, was meant to solve a series of problems that people thought we had with the financial system. And one of those was the idea that central intermediaries like banks or regulators were toying with the monetary system in ways that were cheating other people and making the system unfair. In fact, they blamed that as opposed to malfeasance or other activities for the lead up to the global financial crisis. And the premise was, what if we could do away with all of that by simply replacing it with technology?
So you're saying no banks. You don't need the banks. You don't need the SEC. You don't need the CFTC. Get rid of all that stuff.
Or the Fed, I think most
the Fed,
important.
the Fed in particular, right?
Yeah. What if you could exchange assets online in a digital age in a way that was quote unquote secure and safe and free from counterfeiting, but in a way where you could trust that the other person on the other side of the transaction wasn't going to rip you off? And so the premise of crypto technology is based on the idea that you can send secure messages across a network and then use this distributed ledger to track all of those transactions in a way that everyone can see it, just like a Google spreadsheet where everyone opens up at the same time. And then you can verify those transactions, not with one intermediary, but with a network of intermediaries, all participating in verifying that transaction, all with an incentive to make everyone is staying clean, so to speak. That's the theory.
Yeah.
Whether that works in practice is something I think we're skeptical of.
All right. So Hillary made a good point that one of the things that people criticize most is the Federal Reserve. There's this perception that the Federal Reserve fuels inflation because it can create money from thin air. With Bitcoin, there's a fixed number of Bitcoin that can ever exist. And so the idea is that it's not inflationary. True or false? Maybe Hillary, take that one.
It's deflationary, which causes its own set of problems, right? Assuming that the fixed supply does remain fixed, and I'll speak to that in a moment. Think about it. If you know that your sort of money will always buy more tomorrow than it will today, then that's encouragement not to spend it, right? And deflation is actually worse for economic conditions than inflation. So I think that's often gets lost in the shuffle, that this idea that actually a deflationary currency is a terrible idea. But going back to what you and Mark were just talking about, this all started as it was supposed to be a payment system or a money, but it became pretty clear pretty quickly that it wasn't going to work out that way. Because it is so volatile, its price swings around, that just wasn't credible. And then, as I mentioned, the technology is kind of clunky for the blockchain. So it takes too long for these payments to process. And it soon became pretty clear that this wasn't going to work very well as a money or a payment. So what it became was something that people bet on, the value. So that's where sort of the investment part of it came in. But you can't actually be both money and an investment, because with money, you need the price to stay stable. And with an investment, you need the price to increase. So you kind of have to pick one, or as I like to say, pick neither. But yeah, so the idea that this Bitcoin that the supply is fixed, that it is digital gold, that we don't have to worry about central banks messing with the money supply, is something that I think is taken as an article of faith, and I'm not sure it's true. Because the reason why the supply is fixed is because that's what the computer code on the Bitcoin blockchain says. But computer code can be changed. And in fact, hackers have gotten pretty close to changing that aspect of the code. The people who actually are in charge of programming that code, if they got paid off by a nation state, they could inflate the supply. So, it's not an article of faith in the same way.
Right. I'm going to start taking in some of the excellent questions we're getting from the audience. And one of them uses the term digital currency. Of course, cryptocurrency is a digital currency, but there are also central bank digital currencies, which are a slightly different thing here. We haven't gotten into that yet. Maybe we should, but just for now, I want to ask, this anonymous attendee said, do you think digital currency will ever become the de facto international currency? And is fiat currency something we will see disappear in our lifetime? So maybe we could start by differentiating between digital and fiat. And the fact is that the central bank digital currency is still a fiat currency that gets complicated.
So I'm going to jump in because I feel a little passionate about this question, but Hilary can make sure I steer the ship correctly here. I think, first of all, we tend to refer to crypto assets as crypto assets for the reasons that Hilary explained. Very few of the assets we see on the market today function in the way that a currency does, a form of money. Well, there are stable coins, which are also not money, in fact, are backed by reserves that are based on sovereign issuance of assets. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. They approach what money does, but not quite. So we prefer the term crypto assets because most of the use case we've seen thus far is in speculative investment.
Right.
Will it ever replace fiat currency? I kind of hope not. And the reason is, I think, and this is a broader governance question, right? The origin story of crypto and Bitcoin is built around the idea that somehow we can never trust central banks. And there's certainly a lot of critique one can have about the central bank system. But here's the thing. In hundreds of years of history, we learned the hard way through the wildcat banking era, through other eras where we decided to sort of privatize aspects of monetary policy, that doesn't work out well for a lot of people. And so in our country today, a lot of the sovereign rights associated with currency are with governments. And that's because governments, as flawed as they are for now, are democratically elected and controlled. And we can inform how policy works through those government-issued currencies. The idea of having some global currency or some sort of decentralized currency sounds attractive until you think about the reality of how crypto works, which is today and likely in the future, it is not truly decentralized, and therefore it is just as subject to the same kinds of controlled wealthy interests that we see in our current financial system. So you are essentially replacing one set of masters with another. And so I think rather than focus on the idea of digital currency replacing fiat currency, we should be thinking about how to have global international financial policy that is fair and equitable across all these spaces, regardless of what the payment mechanism is.
Eric, explain what you mean when you say it's really not decentralized. Why is it not?
So when you look at how most crypto platforms and work today, right? You can look at Bitcoin and say that that asset has been issued on a blockchain that has been managed or controlled by different nodes in this network. But focusing too much on the technology ignores the economics. The actors and activities and assets in crypto today, the stable coins, Bitcoin, Ether, the platforms where things are traded, the governance tokens that act as sort of ersatz shareholders, shares in controlling the governance of the systems, are all highly centralized. Even the infrastructure is centralized in all but name. And what that means is that instead of a system where there is some level of distributed organization around how that money is managed, you have sort of centralization by another name. And centralization has value. It's how our system works, and we have checks and balances. But with crypto, the danger is that you sort of get the worst of both worlds. You get the same kind of perverse economic incentives that can come when people abuse that centralization. But crucially, because the industry has resisted complying with a regulatory regime that exists for that system, which is not perfect, but has been built trial and error over 100 years, you don't have the kinds of accountability mechanisms that we see in our traditional financial system. And so you get, not real decentralization and not the best of centralization.
Mark, I saw a quote from somebody along those lines. He said, it's so interesting. It's like a laboratory for money, because we are seeing the crypto people rediscover year by year all the lessons that were learned about regular money over centuries.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Now I want to go back to the questions. The first is a comment, not a question, but you may have a reaction to it. Eugene Cornell says, crypto is frictionless, which in fact is not a good thing. You have these cases where people are being kidnapped and tortured to get their wallets being where the digital currency is held. And then in seconds, they can be wiped out and untraceable. Having public non-anonymous ledgers is a good thing. The wallet is only as safe as your computer. Any reaction?
I mean, I'll jump in, because I think it's really important to understand the privacy concerns associated with using a blockchain for your transactions. And in many ways, it's the worst of both worlds, because every transaction that happens on a blockchain is visible to everyone in the whole world. It doesn't have your name, but it's got your wallet address. Now, that seems like it might be a good tool for law enforcement who are trying to track funds, and sometimes it is. But the most sophisticated users have all kinds of tools, mixers, tumblers, like Tornado Cash, which was sanctioned under the Biden administration, that they can use to obscure their use of it. So that's the frictionless that I think that the comment was referring to. But the other side of the coin is, if people don't really have the time or the money or the sophistication to use those tools like mixers and tumblers, someone can see every single transaction that they've done. And so I always frame it this way, what happens if you break up with your boyfriend and he knows that what your public wallet address is? He can see every transaction that you do. And that can allow him to deduce all kinds of information about what you're doing, who you're hanging out with, where you're living. I'm not sure that that's sort of a world we want to live in. And just to go back to the point that Mark and you were discussing earlier, Peter, I understand a lot of the distrust that motivated the space, the creation of crypto. But the fact of the matter is, it just means you're trusting someone else. You're trusting whole other individuals, a place without, transparency into who is running the show. There's no regulation then that would protect people's identity and things like that. So you're really not eliminating trust. You're just putting your trust in an unregulated system. And for so many reasons, including this privacy reason, I think that's a little bit of a scary thing to do. Also, as the comment referred to, there's the criminal issues. I mean, crypto is being used to fund half of the North Korean nuclear program. It is being used, it is the goal of all the ransomware attacks that are attacking our hospitals and infrastructures. We're starting to see really gruesome crimes. There was a spate of them in France where people were having their fingers dismembered in kidnappings trying to get access to crypto cold storage wallets. So it's there are consequences when you operate in a space without laws, and I don't think that's something that we should eagerly want to jump into.
Yeah, do not want to be dismembered.
No.
No. So here's a question that I think maybe a lot of people have, and it's pretty basic. So either one of you, this is from an anonymous attendee. When you buy some form of crypto, whom do you pay? How is the purchase accounted for? And how do you sell it? And who pays it to you?
I can give that a shot. I mean, I think it really depends on the scenario. The most typical scenario for most retail crypto investors, again, there are a lot of esoteric, novel, decentralized that sort of crypto diehards will participate in. But for most people, the people you might know who decide to take a whirl, right, they're going to download an app on their phone, maybe from the platform Coinbase, and they're going to be interacting with a centralized exchange that acts as your custodian. So they keep track of your assets and hold them in trust. They act as your broker. They're supposed to go out and find you willing traders, people who want to buy what you're selling or sell what you're buying. They act as sort of a market maker. So we're going to buy X number of coins so that everyone knows that there's some liquidity here, that there's enough action to trade in. And they play a number of other roles. And so in that instance, which accounts for the predominant amount of activity in crypto markets, there's a lot of trading on Coinbase, the big platform Binance, FTX when it was still around and solvent. You're buying crypto assets from other people who are selling them, or other asset issuers. Maybe they're companies, or maybe they're a third party. So a little bit akin to what you might do in the stock market, but with some key differences, right? One of the concerns we have from an investor and protections consumer standpoint is that current practice in crypto today, crypto kind of wants to be all things at once, right? That description I described to you of the sort of all-in-one house model sounds nice from sort of a tech user-friendly perspective, but in traditional finance, those roles are broken out for a reason. Your broker has different incentives than the exchange. The broker makes money getting you the best price, but the exchange makes money all the trading fees, and the people representing the other buyers make it a different way. So all that under one roof without things that mitigate and deal with those conflicts of interest actually puts retail investors sort of at a loss, and they're more likely to be exploited either by other traders or by the platforms themselves. And meanwhile, there's less disclosure about who they're actually buying and selling from. When you're trading on a publicly regulated market, there's voluminous information that traders, brokers, asset issues have to disclose on a timely basis that allows people to understand the calculated risk. And in crypto, it's a much more loosey-goosey space, right? So I think, using that question to open up the broader theme of like, what does it actually mean to trade in crypto is pretty important for people to understand.
And if I can jump in, there are a bunch of other conflicts of interest you should be aware of. So I think the most critical one with these crypto exchanges is that you have sort of the brokerage and the exchange under one roof. But if you take a crypto exchange like Coinbase, Coinbase also has an affiliated venture capital fund, right? So they're creating crypto coins for their investors, to buy. So that's a conflict of interest. They're also one of the key validators for crypto transactions using proof of stake on the Ethereum. And I know it just sounded like I was speaking a foreign language, but basically they have a large role to play in deciding which transactions get updated to the ledger. And the order in which they get processed is a big deal, because if someone, pays a little extra to get their transaction processed before someone else, they can make a lot of money that way. So there's conflicts of interest there. And then Coinbase also has a strong relationship with Circle, the stablecoin issuer. So it's just there's a web of conflicts of interest that you wouldn't find in traditional finance with these exchanges.
Right. Stablecoins have come up a couple of times, and I've actually written about them myself. And in some ways, they come across as we're the good citizens of crypto. We actually can be used in transactions, and we promise you that we're going to have a stable value because we're going to have reserves for every dollar stablecoin. We're going to have a dollar in assets parked somewhere safe. Why is it then that the Bank for International Settlements and the Federal Reserve and so on are so worried about stablecoins? What's the problem? Seems like a pretty safe thing.
Mind if I take this one, Mark?
Please, that's a go stability all the way.
Yeah, no, this is my baby. So I testified before the Senate on stablecoins in 2021. This has been my beat for a long time. So stablecoins are prone to runs, right? So they are, what you get is a notation on a ledger, a distributed ledger or blockchain that says you own the stablecoin, right? And unlike most other crypto assets, this one actually does have something behind it. It's linked to a reserve of assets. But that reserve of assets fluctuates in value. Now, the assets are typically pretty high quality, so it doesn't fluctuate too much, but it fluctuates. And all of the research from the entities that you mentioned has shown that these things lose their dollar peg all the time. And so what is likely to happen, and I should say, I think the reason why we haven't really seen a big run on a stable coin yet is because despite all the rhetoric about these being used for payments and these being, good citizens, et cetera, they're primarily used for two things. And one is as an on and off ramp for crypto speculation. So people aren't buying coffee with these. They're using them to park their money between their Bitcoin and Ethereum trades. And then the other reason is they're very much liked for illicit payments. For both of those two things, you're not going to be as sensitive to small fluctuations in price because you either don't want to kill the golden goose or you're betting anyway. So who cares if it moves a little bit? But if these really do start to take off as payments, and that's possible now that we've seen legislation passed in the United States in the form of the Genius Act a couple of months ago, then people, I think, are going to become a lot more sensitive to fluctuations in their price. And if that happens, then if people see that they've lost their peg, and as I said, this happens all the time. And one really notable example was in March of 2023, one of the stable coins, USDC, had $3.3 billion of reserves on deposit with Silicon Valley Bank. And in fact, it way lost its peg. And you can think of the Silicon Valley Bank bailout essentially as a bank bailout of Circle and USDC. I think that would have been potentially the end of that had the government not stepped in to bail out those depositors. And what that shows you is that these things are susceptible to runs. And if we do have a run, what happens? The stablecoin issuer has to start selling off its best assets. Or at least, so some of the assets will be in cash. So it needs to start using the cash. It's going to pull that out of the banks where that cash is held. That could start a run on a bank. Once it gets through the cash, it's going to have to start selling off its treasuries. That could mess with the treasuries markets if it's happening en masse, which are just a focal point for so many other financial markets. So when things start going haywire in the treasury markets, it goes haywire everywhere else. Yeah. So that run risk, which is entirely not contemplated by the Genius Act, the Genius Act was passed on the assumption that there would never be a run on a stablecoin. That run risk is part of why those institutions are worried. Those institutions are also worried because it could limit their monetary policy. Without deposits going into banks, that's less money in the banking system. The monetary policy, the setting of interest rates, happens through the relationship between the Federal Reserve and banks. So that can cramp monetary policy. And also, it could cramp the availability of credit. Because when the money is sitting in a stable coin, it's sitting in cash. It's like putting it under the proverbial mattress. When money's deposited in banks, banks lend it out. So there's a bunch of different flow-on consequences from these stable coins that make them nowhere near as sort of safe and something you don't need to worry about as they're sometimes portrayed.
And Peter, if I could jump in real quick on that, I think Hilary's comment reveals a really broader theme here, which is that what that that process of being issued a stable coin with a promise that the issuer will redeem you in full at the price that you paid for, that's describing in many ways what banks already do today with your deposits. And
Yeah.
that's important to understand because with crypto and with other financial technology firms and with other permutations of financial innovation, innovation sounds great and can be really valuable, but it's not necessarily an inherent good. And in fact, a lot of financial innovation that's presented is really entities or actors sort of trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want to perform like banks, but we have rigorous rules around banks like that prevent the kind of runs that Hilary described from happening for good reason, because they're kind of the foundation of the financial system. And so for 20, 30, 40 years, the push-pull has been all these different actors coming in saying, we want to do this activity, but we don't have to comply with the rules that allow us to do that. And so we want you to change those rules. And crypto is certainly the most recent and maybe arguably one of the most aggressive. And I think that the stablecoin debate really, or policy thrust really gets at that, right? Stablecoins are trying to function like banks while still being these other things. They're trying to tell people that they act like bank-like assets, but also are not bank-like assets. And when you do that, it confuses consumers and it amplifies risk instead of tamping it down. So I think that theme is a really big part of the broader policy conversation.
Now, what I want to do now is go to the questions. We're getting a lot of great questions, and please, people, keep sending them in because I'm going to try to get to as many as possible. I'm going to cluster several questions into one because they're related and it's easier to answer them at once than piecemeal. Stanley Goodman says, please explain blockchain. What is it? What does it do for us and for cyber currency? And then I have a question from Jim Cooper says, aren't there Bitcoin miners that constantly increase the supply of Bitcoins? And I think this harks back to what Hilary said about Bitcoin being deflationary. So then who actually is running, quote unquote, programming these crypto computers? And then somebody says, can you explain crypto gas fees associated with buying and selling, and how does that affect your profits? Why do they call it gas fees? And then the last question that I want to cluster here is from Stanley Goodman saying, why is so much energy needed to operate cryptocurrency? What in the process requires all this energy consumption? Is it more energy demanding than traditional currency and stock exchanges?
Shall I?
Sure. I can take some of the mining questions if you want to take some of the other ones.
All right, sounds good. So as I said, a blockchain's a database. The thing that distinguishes it from other databases is who gets to decide which transactions or new entries are added to the database. With a normal database, anybody can do it. Sorry, not anybody can do it. It's a designated trusted individual. The idea with blockchain is they want to let anybody do it. But of course, all kinds of bad things could happen if you let just anybody add transactions to the blockchain. People could pay themselves twice, steal things, etc. So the sort of the quote unquote innovation that made a blockchain is that it came up with a new mechanism for deciding who could add a transaction to the database. And it used a game theory based mechanism called proof of work. This is for the Bitcoin blockchain. And what proof of work means essentially is that a lot of people try and guess a number. And if they guess that number correctly, and they're the first to guess that number, then they essentially win the right to add transactions to the blockchain and get paid for the privilege. So the gas fees that someone asked about, that's what those fees are for. They're paying the validators to encourage or incentivize them to do the work, in this case, of guessing. So the question about whether doesn't this add more to the Bitcoin supply? No, it releases more from Bitcoin's fixed supply. So there is this fixed supply of 21 million, I believe, Bitcoin. They haven't all been released yet. So miners, these Bitcoin miners, who are the people who are performing this proof of work calculation, in other words, running a lot of very expensive computers on a lot of electricity to try and guess this number and get paid, Um, that's sort of there. That's the mechanism that distinguishes this from a traditional database. Now, not all blockchains use that same proof of work mechanism. The Ethereum blockchain used to, for example, and shifted to something else called proof of stake. They're all based on game theory. But the idea is that they're supposed to discourage bad actors from subverting the records on the blockchain because it's expensive. But we've already seen that it's not impossible to subvert this, that a few mining pools working together with the wrong incentives could go ahead and subvert the blockchain. And then someone else asked about, well, who are the computer programmers in this? That's another really important constituency that never gets talked about. A blockchain is software. It is not set and forget. It needs to be maintained. It needs cybersecurity protections. And yet there's no one officially in charge of maintaining the software. So what we have are sort of loose collections or handfuls of people who sort of do it on a volunteer or grant-funded basis to monitor the software, to see where changes or fixes are needed, and then to push them out to other users to adopt. And those people, again, are in a position, should they want, to put some really nasty things in the code to subvert the whole thing. So you're trusting a lot of people in this process, the software developers, the validators. So hopefully that answers a lot of the questions about just how this works. And then Mark, I'm sure you've got more to add.
No, that was great. And I will add some layers, no pun intended, to that. So one reason that it's called a blockchain has to do with the process of verifying transactions that Hilary described. That number that everyone's trying to guess, it's an alphanumeric code. It's a unique code, and it's part of the data packet that is being verified in that block of transactions. Once the transaction or the block is verified, and the next block is sort of queued up for verification, it is linked to the next one by that number. It's called a hash, and that idea of those two transactions, blocks of transactions being linked, is what is supposed to support claims of blockchain's security. Because, as Hilary described, when you have all these different people competing to verify that one transaction, and not anyone's going to win out in any one particular time, it takes a lot of time and money for one or set of individuals to amass enough power and money to try and control that whole network. It's called a 51% attack. And even if they could do that, in theory, they would, in theory, only be able to change one block of the transaction, because in order to change other blocks previously, they would somehow have to alter the previous blocks of transactions, which is difficult to do. So the idea of blockchain comes from these linked chains. But here's the thing. That software system that Hilary described is in some ways very basic. And if you want to do more with your crypto, you have to add additional layers. Some have described a blockchain as sort of like an operating system, and then you have apps on top of that. It's maybe not totally accurate, but it's a useful analogy. And the problem is as you add complexity to that layered set of software things, that's where the chinks get in, because all of that code is open source software, and anything you do to try to make it easier to transact, like off the blockchain or into the blockchain, or to modify the direction of the blockchain, is vulnerable to hacks and exploits from everyone operating in that space. So the vaunted sort of security of crypto is really maybe only true, or at least supportable in a very narrow sense, in that you have a set of secure transactions. But once you try to do anything with them, that's where the funny business gets into it. And so the mining operations is all about cementing those blocks. And the energy use is associated with proof of work that Hilary described, because it's become an arms race. The more computers you have running 24/7, the more opportunities you'll have to verify transactions. And in fact, one of the ways we talk about crypto as being centralized is that large mining pools control most of the mining activity on the Bitcoin blockchain. It's 2 or 3 companies control a majority of the nodes that do verification. So that theory of someone not being able to control anything because it's too complicated isn't very supportable, because you have consolidation in that industry. And that means miners can influence who gets paid when, which transactions are processed when. There's even some concern national security risks, because some of those mining entities have ties back to, other states like China, who might be able to manipulate things. So sorry if I went on, but I think there's a lot to unpack there. It's really important how those pieces fit together.
So we've been handling some pretty heavy duty stuff here, and it's important because if you really want to understand blockchain and crypto, you need to have a grasp of these things. But now I want to move into something which I think is probably a little easier for people to grasp, which is politics, the politics of crypto. And somebody's name hasn't come up yet, which is Donald Trump. Is very active in crypto. His family has issued coins and so on. So, and then I just saw the news today that the co-founder, whatever, of Binance was pardoned. So I don't know where you want to go with that, but why is Trump so pro-crypto, and is this something you're worried about?
I guess as the policy person, I'll start, Hilary. Is that all right? How to keep this short and sweet? The crypto industry faced a tremendous amount of blowback from its sort of self-inflicted crash and failures in 2022. And as we might all remember, in 2020 and 2021, there was a big crypto bubble. You couldn't, turn around a corner, metaphorically speaking, without figuring about another crypto endorsement, another celebrity involved in crypto. It seemed like everything was kind of coming up roses for the industry until the crash of 2022, which I won't go into now, but most people focus on the collapse of FTX, which was due to malfeasance and fraud and financial mismanagement. But FTX was really just the tip of the iceberg. Many, many platforms collapsed, and they collapsed because they were interconnected, fragile, over-leveraged, poorly managed, and essentially riding a wave of hype that no one wanted to stop until the music stopped playing. And Binance was a part of that in a certain way, which we'll get to. And faced with that collapse, the crypto industry had a choice. They could accept the fact that there was a huge problem with the way their platforms were operating. The regulators had largely said, look, guys, we want you to, have an opportunity to sell your business, but you can't do it when it's against the law. You need to come in and register or comply. And the industry said, no, we can't do that. We're above the law, or the laws aren't fit for purpose. So instead of taking accountability, what they did was essentially blame the regulators for the problems that occurred. They said the regulators were both too punitive and not punitive enough. They simply said that, that there was an attack on crypto. And because crypto entities can find money from wealthy venture capital firms, which are often the seed funders for a lot of their platforms, because I'm exaggerating, but not quite, they can sort of literally print their own money. They spent a tremendous amount of money in the 2024 election cycle, targeting a lot of different political figures, and soon found kind of a rapport with the Trump family and the Trump campaign. And they have been very successful in that regard. They spent more money than pretty much any other corporate entity in the 2024 elections. And now they have friends in every regulatory agency in the Trump administration, from the SEC to the CFPB to Treasury. And you have crypto industry folks providing direct contributions to the Trump administration. And the Trump administration is therefore dismissing regulatory cases levied against those same individuals. And most notably was CZ. CZ and Binance was pled guilty to money laundering and sanctions evasion charges that totaled somewhere around $43 billion in fines. They were literally caught red-handed with quotes saying, we are running a unlicensed, unregistered security exchange, and please come launder your money with us. But as it turns out, the Trump administration seems to have discovered that just like the rest of the crypto industry, you can make a lot of money very quickly on a lot of speculative assets. And if you promise people that you're not going to come down hard in a regulatory fashion, they will support your efforts and he will support theirs. And so I think all of the Trump crypto ventures, Trump's wealth is now predominantly crypto. He's made billions in the last 9 months. Many of the coins he's issued have actually gone to zero and hurt consumers, but that has not stopped him and his family from accumulating hundreds of millions of dollars of fees. This raises huge conflict of interest and corruption concerns. There's really nothing like it in any other presidency we've seen, but also raises big questions about sound financial regulation today. So hopefully that rant answered a few questions. Hilary, you should please say something a little more sober if you would like.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if this is more sober, but I mean, I just want to emphasize that crypto has always been a political project. And this is something that I think, especially in this moment when we're dealing with AI as well, like we need to recognize that these technologies aren't always all they're cracked up to be. And in fact, may not succeed on their own merits. It's not natural selection with a lot of these technologies. It's in fact dependent on getting special legal treatment that enables the business to succeed. So I actually sort of dug up a quote. In 2021, the New York Times reported that delivering significant returns on all their crypto investment, executives at the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz quickly realized, would necessitate playing a major role in shaping rules for these companies. Right? So this has been, since the beginning, really the playbook. Was to get, we've talked a lot about blockchain, and as I've said, it's really, for all its intricate technological decentralization, and as Mark said, it actually hasn't succeeded in eliminating the need to trust people. It hasn't succeeded in decentralizing economic power and control. So really, it is really a failure as a technology, because you're better off with the traditional database, which is much more efficient, doesn't have to deal with all those game theory-based mechanisms to process transactions. Sure, you have to trust someone, but you have to trust someone with blockchain too. So it's a failure as a technology. The one thing it has sort of excelled at, if you will, is that its technological complexity has allowed people to tell stories about it. Stories about how it's this new technology that's too complex for you little silly people to understand. You don't understand what it can do. And once you understand what it can do, you will totally appreciate that existing laws cannot be applied to us because we're so special. So therefore, we need our own special laws, and we are going to lobby like hell to get them. And I want to emphasize that this really wasn't just focused on the presidential level. Mark mentioned the sort of the levels of expenditure. Almost half of all corporate PAC expenditures in the 2024 election cycle were from the crypto industry, but a lot of them went to congressional races and Senate races. So, for example, they went really hard after Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who was someone who had been a thorn in their side in terms of getting the kind of laws passed that they wanted. They threw their money behind Alyssa Slotkin and Ruben Gallego, who are now freshman senators, because of expectations that they would be supportive of the industry. And one thing that I think is particularly galling is that with all the ads that money purchased, that crypto super PAC money purchased, none of them mentioned crypto, because they knew that in 2024, only 8% of Americans had any crypto investments at all, even a smidge. Only 8% of Americans. And even for the Americans who did, this often wasn't their primary issue. So it really was, whilst the money swayed the election, the issue was irrelevant to most Americans. And I think that's really sort of an indictment of our current politics.
Yeah. There's a great question here going back to Donald Trump from an anonymous attendee. And I'll go to you on this, Hilary. How can Trump have made so much money when so many coins lost value?
Yeah, so this is, much like the stock market, and people often get this confused. If you buy a share in Apple and, you're not buying it from Apple. You're buying it from someone else most of the time, unless it's an IPO or another public offering. You're just buying it from someone else in the market. So the people who are winning and losing money in most trades are not the company itself. So if we use that analogy, the people who are winning and losing money on a lot of these crypto trades is not Donald Trump. He makes money on the initial sale. So when that first sale of his crypto coins happens, that's when he gets his money.
He doesn't care so much what happens to it afterward.
Yeah. And then afterwards, people are trading and people lose money. And so what we've seen consistently in all of the crypto markets is the whales, the big fish, they always manage to get out in time, and it's always the little investors, who end up being the bag holders, who end up taking the losses.
Yeah. Mark, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think there's a study by, I believe, the Bank of International Settlements that looked at Bitcoin investors from 2015 to 2022 and found that 75% of investors who held money during that period lost money. And while obviously prices have since gone up and fluctuated since then, the point is that you often see with stock market trends or market trends, particularly with tech trends, you see a pattern of early adopters and early investors who get in early, and then retail investors tend to follow. And that's fine, except that what that means is they end up chasing bubbles. And the bigger the bubble, the bigger the fall. So we've seen crypto investors lose out on the tail end of these bubbles, but more often than not, you have early investors who are benefiting. That includes the venture capital firms who have the early seed funds. They get special treatment early on. They get sort of preferred stock, if you will, coins that deliver at a certain point in time when it reaches a certain price. It's really a game that is extractive in nature. And so I think that's important to understand that, you hear about crypto as being scammy. That's true. It's a vector for a lot of scammy criminal behavior, but often the business models themselves are extractive. And I think that's less understood, that in order for one set of people to win, another set of people have to lose. And that's not really a source of financial inclusion. That's a form of wealth extraction, but crypto is nonetheless presented as a tool for financial inclusion.
And if I just jump in really quickly on that, because I think that's really important for understanding why these are not really great as an investment. An investment has the possibility of a win-win. You give your money to someone, they deploy that productively, they do well, you do well. When you're just dealing with a crypto asset that is essentially you're betting on its price movements, it's zero sum. There is no possibility for a win-win.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We're coming up on 8:30, which is when I want to wrap this. So please, people, put your questions in now. This is the last chance to ask these two experts. Pick their brains while you can. What do you make of the recent price trends in Bitcoin versus gold versus the stock market? Either one of you.
So, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about, as Bitcoin is often called digital gold, and that's because of the analogy of the fixed supply of Bitcoin. But as I said, that supply can be messed with, and really, we've seen increasingly that Bitcoin's price tends to move more with the equities markets, suggesting that it's sort of seen more as an investment than digital gold. And I think I've seen divergence lately with gold price going up and Bitcoin price going down. Mark, did you have anything to add on that?
No, I think that's correct. I mean, I think to add to that, there was a huge crash in crypto markets about a week ago, and it taught us a couple things, right? The crash theoretically was precipitated by an announcement by President Trump that he was going to raise 100% tariffs on Chinese goods in response to China's threat to restrict export of rare earth minerals. Regular markets took a little bit of a hit there. Bitcoin and Ether dropped by about 13%. But the real damage was in the so-called altcoin market, which is this market of a wide range of crypto assets, some of them no more than meme coins, a little more than kind of figments of people's imagination that are highly speculative. And Bitcoin is not only price sensitive markets, Bitcoin prices amplify losses in other parts of the markets, because if Bitcoin is volatile, those assets are even more so. But the thing that really tanked those markets was a combination of just hyper leverage. People were making bets upon bets upon bets. One thing you hear in crypto lingo is often people want to 10x or 100x their investments. That means they basically want to multiply their investment by a certain amount, but it also refers to the amount of leverage or loans they've taken out to support that bet. And there has been a wave of speculation and leverage betting in crypto markets on these altcoins, simply assuming that the number would always go up. But of course, it didn't. And I think that belies this claim that Bitcoin is a sort of store of value or this hedge against market activities, because It is sensitive to other market conditions and external prices. It's not a place of refuge. And when it collapses, it is sort of the backbone of broader crypto markets, and changes in its price can have much broader impacts outside of just the Bitcoin price.
And I want to jump on that for a minute, because I think it's really important for those who may be thinking, well, I'm not invested in crypto, why should I care? Right? Because the thing is, crypto has the potential to have all kinds of negative externalities. We've alluded to environmental ones, criminal ones, but also it could cause a financial crisis a la 2008, right? Because it replicates and exacerbates all the problems that we have in our traditional financial system. Mark just mentioned leverage, complexity, interconnection, tenuous assets. Like back in 2008, we had very creative assets, but somewhere, somehow, tenuously, they were linked to a house. Crypto's gotten rid of the need for a house. You can create these assets out of thin air. You can borrow against them. All the margin calls are highly automated so that there's no one who can stop it. If you've borrowed to buy your crypto and the price tanks, then your portfolio is just going to get liquidated. That's going to push the asset prices down further, and you're going to get all these ripple effects. And we've seen versions of this, as Mark alluded to, in 2022, and even to some extent, there was a 2018 crash, the ICO boom. Neither of those infected the rest of the financial markets, because regulators at that point were holding the line, keeping crypto separate, not entirely, but largely separate from the rest of our financial system. With the Trump administration, we've seen a 180 on that. And as I said, the laws that the industry is looking for, they actively want to integrate the crypto markets with the rest of the financial markets, because they need more funds, right? If your asset is Ponzi-like and you need more people to invest in it for its price to go up, then they want the access to the traditional financial institutions and their money, pension funds, banks, these kinds of things. And so this integration is actively being encouraged now, so that the next time this really blows up, there's no guarantee it won't take down the rest of the financial system with it.
That's scary. So that actually relates to I think I'm going to make this the final question, which I'm going to combine the last two questions that just came in. Ahmed Duran says, when is it going to stop? What does it have to happen for crypto to become irrelevant? Do you see it happening anytime soon? And then anonymous attendee has a related question. Where is crypto going? Over the hour, I've heard one negative after another, but it's making huge profits for the richest and most powerful.
Very good questions. I guess I'll take a stab at it and say, I think there are a lot of advocates and public interest voices, people on the Hill, academics, and experts who are, very valiantly trying to stop the bleeding, trying to push for policies that will hold the crypto industry to similar standards as the current financial system, trying to sort of mitigate or limit the scope of the potential damage. And so I think that's what my organization, AFR, does. It's what many other groups do. And we are, have to be hopeful that we can reach policymakers who really aren't totally bought in with the industry's sort of kind of overly optimistic attitude towards crypto's benefits versus its risks, and we'll see the longer term. I think the reality is that it may need to get worse before it gets better. I think the money pressure, it cannot be overstated. We literally, anecdotally, heard from policymakers and their staff that votes on some of these policies were not about what's the right policy. It was just about how can I make sure that I don't have a super PAC on my back in the next election. And with that kind of dynamic, it's very difficult to do good policymaking. So I think we can look to state regulators to provide some support, but unfortunately, it may have to get worse. And look, I don't have a crystal ball. There may be elements of the crypto industry that do provide merit, that do provide some value. There are aspects of it that could be integrated in the financial system without having to buy into the whole thing. Who knows? I'd be happy to be wrong if something provided value without this huge amount of risk. But I think you don't even have to sort of believe that there's some utility there to recognize that the risks we've described far outweigh some of that utility. So I think it's really up to people out there who are being asked to sign up for this new version of finance without really being told what's under the hood, to call on their policymakers to say, hey, like, I didn't sign up for this. Are we sure this is the right direction to go? And here's the thing, if we're talking about financial inclusion, if we're talking about making things better for people, one, we have a lot of tools that we don't need to rely on blockchain for. A lot of financial problems are tough but simple. It's about just getting people bank accounts. And then also buying into the idea that crypto is sort of the solution to generations of inequality and wealth, massive inequalities and things. It's a bit of a fool's game all its own, because those problems are not technological in nature. They're economic, they're democratic, they're governance issues, and that's where values and democratic processes come in. So we need to defend those things and all the things we can get from it, from improving wages, improving working conditions, things that provide lasting wealth and security for people, instead of asking people to sort of gamble on us on that space. So yeah. I hope that helped give some hope or some direction. I know it's pretty pie in the sky, but I think that's what we're trying to achieve.
So if I get the closing word. So in 2022, when everything collapsed, I celebrated prematurely. I thought everyone has now seen this industry for what it is. We're done here. But unfortunately, as Mark said, it didn't get bad enough to convey that, or perhaps it was simply that the war chests of the venture capital firms were too fat from the decade plus of zero interest rate policy, and they needed to put them somewhere, and they poured them into lobbying and rehabilitating the technology. And I would say, to Mark's point, well, maybe, we will see that there's some there. That still doesn't discount all the harms and the limitations. And I think this is really important as well, because we're seeing the exact same playbook play out with AI, right? AI can do something, but the research is increasingly clear that it does not deliver on the productivity gains that people are expecting. It causes just an enormous variety of harms. It only succeeds as a business model because they flout environmental and copyright laws. That's been admitted by the industry. So this same sort of, surely the facts should prove that we need to do something, is not working. And so I think there's sort of a high and a low answer to this. And the high answer is, I think we desperately need campaign finance reform. I've also heard the same stories that Mark has heard about people saying, I don't support this industry, but I just don't want to have them funding my opponent. Sure. And that is a little bit above my pay grade. But the low answer, I think, is really just about what we're doing here, which is talking about this stuff, right? So much of it is the power of narrative, right? They have that going for them. We're often too credulous as a society about what technology can really do, and we're too timid to ask, can it really solve that problem? Because we feel like we're out of our depths when confronted with what seems like highly sophisticated and complex new tech. But a truth I hope you'll take away from tonight is that technologies in the end are just tools, and just like other tools, they depend on who develops and deploys them. We need to pay attention to the goals of the people in Silicon Valley who are developing and deploying these tools. And we need to understand that they're selling something, and you should treat it with, the same way you would treat a promise from a used car salesman, with skepticism. And I think, if we stop being quite so dazzled by this stuff, start asking questions, start with a presumption of skepticism that it's on them to convince us that it can actually do what they say it does, rather than us just having to believe that it will succeed in solving all our problems. I think if we can change the narrative here on the ground, and even, as I like to say, make fun of it, I think, humor and satire are great weapons. I think that is a way of tackling it from the bottom up, because right now the top down requires campaign finance reform.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. I just want to read a comment from Stanley Goodman, just came in. He said, thank you. This was one of the most valuable, instructive sessions I've attended. And I've been involved with a bunch of these myself, and I agree. The two of you have been excellent, and the questions from the audience have also been really strong, and they provoked good answers. So Thanks to everybody involved. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Lana.
All right. Well, thank you to all of our presenters tonight for sharing your expertise with us. To our audience, we'd love to hear from you as to your opinions from our discussions and what actions you are taking in your community. You can email us at info@nfrpp.org. As always, you can make a donation on our website so we can continue these insightful programs at nfrpp.org. Please join us for our next program, November 20th, which will be an in-depth discussion of socialism. Thank you and good night.
Bye.